Okay, so today we're going to talk about the Cold War. We're going to talk about basically the contest between two great superpowers. I would like for you to go ahead and watch the first video, supplemental video, the Rocky IV clip. Take a second to watch this video and then come back to this lecture. Okay, so that video clip was from Rocky IV. It was a training montage contrasting the different training techniques of Rocky with his Soviet enemy, played by Dolph Lundgren. The reason I had you watch this clip is because it emphasizes the fact that there are these two major superpowers who are rivals with one another. They're rivals militarily, they're rivals politically, they're rivals culturally, they're also rivals in sports. Sports being yet another contest in which the two sides can display the superiority of their respective systems. The Olympics, in fact, during the Cold War, were a sort of battleground in which you have the communist countries and capitalist countries competing with one another to prove the superiority of their respective political and economic systems. In fact, if you see that in the Rocky IV montage, there is the assertion that Dolph Lundgren and hence the Soviets were in fact cheating. They were using steroids. Well, steroids actually came from the steroids entered the Western consciousness during the Olympics in the 1950s, when East German, and keep in mind that East Germany, West Germany, they're the same nation, speak the same language. This separation is artificial and relatively recent in the 1950s. But the East German gymnastics trainer, coach, was drinking with his West German counterpart and explaining why he was able to beat the West Germans so badly. And he said, well, we've been injecting our athletes with anabolic testosterone, right? So these athletes in East Germany were basically getting juiced. And of course, once the East Germans had let the secret out, the West Germans started to juice their athletes, and soon it became an across-the-board phenomenon. And that's what's ironic, is that in this movie starring Sylvester Stallone, you know, Dolph Lundgren is using steroids, but the reality is that Sylvester Stallone was on steroids the entire time. If you take Jose Canseco's book at face value, basically every athlete at some point, you know, and there's a film called Bigger, Stronger, Faster, which I suggest if you're interested in the history of sports, you take a look at it. It describes just how big of a deal, just how widespread steroids are, and it tackles some of the myths associated with steroid use, etc. But you know, this film was a piece of Cold War propaganda. It was during what we call Cold War II in the 1980s. This was a period of Cold War propaganda in which the superiority of the two systems were on display. This competition, and you can see that in this image here of Kennedy, President of the United States, and Premier of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, arm wrestling on this table, about to push the nuclear button and engage in a nuclear conflict. At this time, I'd like you to look at the second video posted, the trailer for Rambo III, if you wouldn't mind going ahead and looking at that. Okay, in 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and this would be a bloody war, very long war for the Soviet Union. The attempt to occupy Afghanistan and pacify it was in the end fruitless. It was a drain on the Soviet Union's resources, manpower, and the attempt to try to turn Afghanistan into this communist, atheistic state. In the film, in the trailer, the Rambo 3 is set during this invasion, Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And the idea is that Colonel Troutman, Rambo's mentor, commander, friend, he was captured by the Soviets in Afghanistan, and Rambo's staging a rescue mission. And Rambo meets up with Mujahideen, with Muslim holy warriors inside Afghanistan who are fighting the Soviets, who in fact are being funded by the CIA with American tax dollars to fight against the Soviets. And of course they held up, just as the Soviets funded the Viet Cong to fight against the United States in the Vietnam War, the United States funded the Mujahideen to battle the Soviets in Afghanistan. And of course the successors of these Mujahideen, their followers, would eventually go on to form the Taliban in the 1990s, which would be what the United States is currently battling in Afghanistan today. The events of the 1990s, 2000s, being after effects of this funding of the Mujahideen against the Soviets in Afghanistan. But that brings up the second major theme, not just contest between these two powers, but contest between these two powers using proxy states. So the United States and the Soviet Union, they cannot fight it out. They can't fight it out because they both possess nuclear weapons, and they will both destroy the world if they battle directly. So they fight. They fight against one another to prove the superiority of their systems by what we call brushfire wars or proxy wars. Wars in third world countries where you have the first world, which is the capitalist world, the second world, which is the Soviet Union communist bloc, the third world, which are the developing nations, and the first two worlds fight one another over the third world. Whether or not Vietnam would be a democracy or a communist state. Right? That's a contest of the Cold War. The two sides fighting each other through these proxy states. If we look in 1945 and we compare the two powers, Soviet Union had the largest ground army in the world in 1945. Huge numbers of tanks. This is due to the effort that the Soviet Union took in driving back the German army. The German army was the most technologically advanced, best trained ground army in the world prior to the defeat in the Second World War. So it took a Herculean effort on the part of the USSR, despite the fact that the USSR was so much more massive, with so much more in terms of resources and manpower. The Soviets had to develop the T-series of tanks, several new types of artillery, all in an attempt to drive out Nazi Germany. And in doing so, they created this humongous land army. By contrast, the United States Army was smaller, but the United States had relied on air power during World War II. The carpet bombing of Germany, air power during the invasions of southern Italy, and the invasion of Normandy, air power particularly in the conflict with Japan, where massive bombing of Japan, bombing of Japanese ships, and ultimately the atomic bombs. The United States turned to air power to attempt to balance these as its emphasis militarily. And this made sense for the United States and for the Soviet Union, these respective strategies. The Soviet Union was fearful of another invasion from the West by land. The United States had an ocean on both sides of it and needed to be able to project its power very quickly on the other side of the globe. The USSR, in imitation of Germany, had developed a very strong submarine force. These are underwater ships designed to strike at surface ships. The United States Navy developed a strong nuclear submarine force in addition to general naval strength. In 1945, the United States will supplant the United Kingdom as the world's dominant naval power. The Soviet Union had developed a strong industrialized economy despite the fact that there had been so much destruction from 1941 to 1945 and so many lives lost, the attempt to salvage industry and to boost industry in this life or death struggle, in fact, had boosted the Soviet economy by leaps and bounds. And of course, the United States economy also was being boosted by wartime effort, with the exception that it in fact was largely untouched by the Second World War. If you look at a map of a graph or list of the nations with the largest GDP compared to the United States, China, I think China's number 2, followed by Japan, followed by Germany. All three of those nations were very badly damaged in the Second World War. China ravaged by Japan. Japan and Germany bombed to oblivion. You also see on there that France, the United Kingdom, these powers also were deeply affected by the Second World War. And so in 1945, the United States enjoyed the fact that its potential economic competitors didn't have large-scale industries. These had largely been destroyed as a result of the fighting. For example, in the 1960s and 70s, Japanese auto manufacturers will begin to build steam. By the 1980s, there will be a huge share of the automobile market that's lost to Japan permanently. Japan having been ravaged in the 1940s, it would take a couple of decades for Japan to recover economically, but once it did, it began to rival the United States in certain areas of production. But the United States enjoyed the advantage of of the largest economy in the world, which it still possesses. But in 1945, it had the largest economy in the world without any approaching rivals besides the USSR. Also, the Soviet Union was seen as anti-colonial. Its rhetoric against the colonizing powers, against empires, against Britain and France, forming colonies, supporting revolutionary movements in different societies. And this made the Soviet Union very influential in countries like the Congo that had been ravaged by a very brutal colonial regime, where the colonial powers, particularly the Francophone colonial powers, France, Belgium, where they had held colonies, you'll see communism grow in strength. And this is directly proportional to the brutality of the colonial powers. It's only in British colonies where you'll see more pro-capitalism, pro-democracy systems emerge in these new states. And in 1945, it was clear European powers were has-beens. They were compared to their previous states, right? These empires were doomed. Countries were bound to become independent, and of course, how these two powers reacted would determine the fate of these powers. And the French reacting very brutally in Algeria, and particularly in Vietnam, which we'll talk about in a moment. This would have tragic effects for more than just France, more than just the French people or the Vietnamese people. These would have worldwide effects. But the Soviet Union and communism was seen as a solution for peoples who were facing starvation, or who had been, its militant rhetoric appealed to people in kind of brutalized conditions. Where in those societies where there was a stronger middle class, where there was more technological development, the United States model of capitalist democracy was better favored. For example, in Turkey is one example. In Thailand, which is a more prosperous country than Vietnam, even though it's in the same part of the world, Thailand had a more stable government. People generally favored the United States model. Finally, the United States was the first to possess the atomic bomb. This gave the United States an intense advantage. Eventually, the Soviet Union obtained the bomb not long after, but it is kind of a credit to the United States that there was a point in which the Soviet Union did not have the atomic bomb, and the United States did not use the atomic bomb, despite the fact that it had a near monopoly on the weapon. And there were some people who felt in 1945, after the 2 atomic bombs were dropped, that the United States would use the atomic bomb to gain hegemony over the entire world. As I stated earlier, Europe had largely been ravaged by the war, and the destruction of Europe. If in 1918, conservative European statesmen like Winston Churchill could say, well, we need to maintain empire. We need to redouble our efforts to maintain our empire, but we can do this. We can make it work, even though we've been dealt these blows and these losses during the First World War. After the Second World War, this is no longer feasible. This is not realistic. The idea of maintaining the British or French empires, these are pipe dreams. The countries themselves in Europe are in many areas are just piles of rubble. The fighting between the Germans and the Soviets, or the Germans and the Americans and British, basically left huge chunks of France, Germany, and even Britain, due to bombing, damaged. So, both the United States and the Soviet Union desired to recreate and reconstruct their own spheres in Europe. The USSR particularly was focused on Eastern Europe. And one of the reasons for this is that, if you recall, during the invasion of Napoleon and during the Second World War, that the USSR faced threats from the West. Western European powers, from Napoleon to Hitler, invading the East, and this was a huge threat from the Soviet point of view, particularly after this German, you have the German invasion in the First World War, you have the German invasion in the Second World War. This German invasion in the Second World War was almost inhuman. The Germans came as ethnic cleansers, and they slaughtered millions of people. So the Soviet mentality is one of needing a buffer between the Soviet Union and the West, and this was the Warsaw Pact. This is why the Soviets refused to leave their sphere in Eastern Europe, refused to abandon these states, and formed an alliance with these states, and desiring to have this buffer between themselves and the West at all costs. And this is the truth behind the Ukraine crisis that's going on right now. The Russians, Putin, they're not going to bend on this Ukraine issue. They're not going to allow Ukraine to become, at least all of Ukraine, to enter NATO, to enter the American and British orbit. This is because they psychologically, Russian foreign policy is based upon keeping this buffer, keeping a buffer between itself and Western Europe. And this invasion was only 70 years ago or so. So while more people living then have begun to die just due to advancing age, it's still part of the cultural consciousness, this brutal invasion by the Germans. So this is very much a national priority for Putin, which is maintaining the territorial security of Russia. And this spread of NATO into Ukraine is seen as a huge threat. So it's one in which, despite the administration and McCain and all the other powerful people who want to push the borders of NATO further east, this is not this is not something that Putin and the Russians are going to bend on. This is something that we would have to fight over, to fight a hot war over. And of course, it's not important enough to the United States and Britain, particularly to sane people in the United States and Britain, in my opinion. That's my bias, to fight over these regions of the Ukraine that are not really, from my perspective, very valuable. In terms of our national interests. They're valuable objectively, but not in terms of what we need to be concerned with. The United States in 1945 had several million men and women under arms in the Navy, in the Army Air Corps, in the Army, in different civilian agencies. And Americans were tired of war. In 1945, the United States had been victorious. Americans wanted to come back to the United States. They wanted to resume normal life, ignore the situation in Europe, Asia, not worry about it. the United States had been victorious, and it was time to enjoy the benefits of peace and economic growth. And you can see that in the baby boom. There's this massive economic prosperity, this huge population surge. There was real fear in the United Kingdom, in West Germany, in France, etc., that the United States, because of public opinion being against international involvement, that the United States would abandon democracies in Western Europe, that Americans would not be committed to defending West Germany, the United Kingdom, etc. So we have this quote by Ismay: "To keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down." That's the purpose of this North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Right? The middle portion, keep the Americans in. This American troops would be stationed in West Germany, so that if the Soviets did in fact invade Western Europe, that Americans would necessarily be killed, would be part of this process, so that the American public, the American government, would have to commit to fighting another world war to protect the western half of the continent. Germany had been split into two. You have the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany, and you have the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany. One was dominated by the United States and Britain, the other by the Soviet Union. East Germany, the eastern half, contained the city of Berlin. So Berlin was completely surrounded by East Germany. There was a portion of Berlin that belonged to West Germany, called West Berlin. Keep in mind, this is completely surrounded by land by East Germany. So the Soviets in 1946, Stalin thought that it would be possible to kind of test the United States' resolve and gain a diplomatic victory, a propaganda victory, and further expand into Western Europe by blockading West Berlin, by blockading this portion of West Germany that's surrounded by East Germany. So Germany, like in Japan, there's a humanitarian crisis in 1946. The agricultural production, industrial production collapsed due to massive bombing, to the destruction of the war. So Germans are having to be supplied, particularly in urban areas, like in West Berlin, they're having to be supplied by either the United States or the Soviet Union. Well, the United States was supplying people in West Berlin with food, with medicine, with other essentials. Well, the Soviet Union, in order to test the United States' resolve and to attempt to kind of intimidate the United States into withdrawing from the city, in 1949 blockaded West Berlin. The idea was that the United States would either have to fight Soviet troops to break the blockade and get supplies into West Berlin, or they would have to back down. And Stalin was thinking, well, they're going to back down. But instead, an ingenious campaign was launched to supply West Berlin by air. We call this the Berlin Airlift. So we're looking at 4,500 tons of supplies dropped per day into Berlin over the course of a year. So rather than starving the people of West Berlin out into submission, this merely doubled everyone's resolve. The United States and the United Kingdom continued to supply Berlin via the air, and eventually the Soviets had to call off the blockade, and it was very embarrassing. But this is the first point in which this Cold War starts to get ramped up, this conflict between these two superpowers in 1949. The Soviets attempting to test American resolve, and the Americans trying to meet that challenge for influence and prestige in Europe. Just as we have division within Europe and the two superpowers kind of fighting for influence in Europe, we have a similar situation in Asia. We have NATO in Europe, we have SEATO, or the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization in Asia. In addition to the Soviet Union and its influence over particularly North Korea and communists in Vietnam, you also have a new variant of Marxism developing in China that's called Maoism, and it's based off the teachings of Mao Zedong, the chairman of the Communist Party of China, the head of state of the People's Republic of China, after the communists win the Civil War in China. Maoism is an ideology based on capitalizing on rural communists. Whereas the Soviet model was about industrial workers in cities, Maoism is about those rural communists out in the countryside fighting a guerrilla war against one another. And this was very effective. The idea was that these guerrilla fighters would maintain the support of the people. Maintaining the support of the population is more important than military objectives in this form of Maoism, because these guerrilla fighters, even if they're defeated, even if they're scattered, they can blend into the civilian population and hide. Right? And this will make them very difficult for the enemy government to uproot. This was very effective in organizing large numbers of rural peasants, particularly in China, Vietnam, etc., into these effective fighting forces. In Japan, the United States was the sole occupier of Japan, and this was something that was not questioned due to the fact that the United States defeated Japan, fought Japan almost single-handedly for much of the war in the Pacific. You can see with this picture of this picture to the right of Soviet soldiers, naval soldiers in Manchuria. You look to the left, you can see pictures of this picture of General Douglas MacArthur, the U.S. Army, standing next to the Emperor Showa, also known as Hirohito. Now, MacArthur took this picture, like so much of his policy in occupying Japan, was designed to appeal to the Japanese mentality. MacArthur had an entire team of anthropologists and historians who had been studying Japanese culture for years prior to the end of the war, and he was able to use this knowledge to his advantage. This is one of the smartest, most effective, most well-run military occupations in the history of the world. There was very little resistance, there was very little in the way of an insurgency, and it's in part because MacArthur really knew how to appeal to Japanese culture to get the Japanese officials, politicians, even the Japanese emperor to do what he wanted. If you recall, on I think it's week 3, we cover the shogunate system in Japan, where you have the emperor who rules in name, but real power is held by the shogun, by this military dictator, this great soldier who rules in the name of the emperor. Well, MacArthur basically recreated that system, the shogunate, with himself as shogun. So, for example, when he would issue an edict, he would have the emperor stamp his seal on that edict. So in fact, the emperor, his dictates his policies were going out to the nation, but in the name of the emperor, and he ran his occupation basically as a shogun, with a very Japanese way of employing elders, employing senior advisors, etc. And this was very effective. Japan recovered in record time. The fact that this country, Japan, was utterly destroyed, the fact that within 10 years it was back up and running, back functional, and a peaceful ally of the United States. And this again is one of the greatest achievements in military occupation in history. And you contrast that with the occupation of Iraq in 2003 under Paul Bremer, one in which the individual culture of the cultures present in the region were largely ignored in terms of policy. For example, Bremer, against the advice of several generals in the armed forces and several other officials, disbanded the Iraqi army, and he disbanded them before disarming them on top of that. So you have these Iraqi soldiers with they have these very complicated, complex clan loyalties, loyalties to different regions, loyalties to different sectarian belief systems, and Sunni, Shia, Kurd, right? They're going back home with weaponry that it helped fuel the insurgency. So we're looking at this is again is a perfect example of how history can help us. In 2003, it was felt that the American way of life, this is part of the kind of neoconservative ideology in 2003, and again, I'm showing my bias here as more of a paleo-conservative person. But if you look at neoconservatism and this idea of empire, this idea that the American way of life is the end of history. There was a historian named Francis Fukuyama, a political scientist more than a historian, but he wrote a book called The End of History, in which he argued that American capitalism and consumerism, that this was the final stage, an ultimate stage in human development. And now that it had triumphed over communism, the entire world would become peaceful and would develop along the American model. And of course, a few years after that, 9/11 happened, and this new wave of conflicts began. But Bremer, Wolfowitz, and some of the other neoconservatives, their ideology was that the American way of life would overcome all cultural obstacles. That these individual cultural obstacles were not relevant, right? That the United States form of capitalism and democracy would just naturally, people would naturally cling to it. And of course, this is the opposite of the mentality that that politicians had employed in 1945, in particular this occupation of the occupations of Germany and Japan, which were very successful, taking into account the local cultural values. And of course, MacArthur, like most Americans at the time, knew that there were significant differences in the mentalities of people in different societies. They had faced the many Japanese troops in battle, which, as we learned last week, these were some of the most committed, to use the term hardcore, these are some of the most hardcore enemies the United States had ever faced. So these military planners, generals, politicians in the United States in 1945, they were very realistic. They didn't allow themselves to be blinded by ideology. They didn't allow themselves they preferred people who had practical knowledge rather than just theoretical knowledge. For example, a civilian like Bremer, the United States would never have put a civilian like that in charge of in charge of a military occupation in 1945. There was much anger with Japan, with the Japanese people, over what had happened in the Second World War. We learned about the rape of Nanking and all sorts of atrocities, Unit 731, etc. And many in China and in Korea were angry over these issues, particularly the comfort women. And so there's been hostility. There's been hostility throughout the decades, and the United States has had to balance out that hostility. The United States is an ally of the Republic of China, or Taiwan. It's an ally of South Korea, and it's an ally of Japan. And two of these allies have a great amount of hostility towards another of these allies, generally speaking, due to anger over the Second World War. So this is something that would shape American policy, foreign policy in the Far East. And I just give this example of this singer here. She's basically the equivalent of Miley Cyrus, Reina Tanaka, causing a huge incident in which she got on her blog and basically made kind of a racist gesture, saying, who am I? I answer a Korean person. Her and her friend here trying to move their eyes as though they were Korean from their racist point of view, and of course this helped fuel anger, and every once in a while there will be massive protests in which Toyotas will be torched. You can see that here on the right, in which people will burn the Japanese flag in China, and less violent protests in Korea, but still a lot of anger. If you, one of the things I point out in the class, I show them a picture from an Audi dealership in China, and there was an Audi dealership in China that was very successful, but the sign that they put up at their dealership ended up causing controversy when it was translated and made aware to others in the Audi Corporation from the West. The sign said, "Even if China is covered in graves, all Japanese must be killed." So, you know, these car dealers, salesmen, in order to boost their sales, they had this sign up calling for the genocide of the Japanese people. And this is part of the anger over the genocide of Chinese people in the Second World War. So the fact that can actually boost your car sales, that's a sign of a lot of anger, a lot of hatred and resentment. So the United States has struggled to balance these different powers. You can see here the picture of former President George Bush with Shinzo Abe, Prime Minister of Japan, the President of South Korea, attempting to reach a consensus in this region, and then this his counterpart over here on the right, Junichiro Koizumi, the Prime Minister of Japan, who is visiting a shrine called the Yasukuni Shrine, which is a shrine in the Shinto religion dedicated to those Japanese who have given their lives in war for the nation. The problem is that there are several Class A war criminals who are honored at the shrine. So if this Prime Minister goes and prays at this shrine, and you can see the Shinto priest here on the right, it's seen in South Korea and China as honoring these war criminals, as the equivalent of someone in Germany going and paying tribute to Hitler and Goering and other prominent Nazis. So the video, I put a video in the description box of I think it's a Canadian journalist actually being evicted from the shrine for pointing out some of the atrocities that were committed in the Second World War by some of those honored there. So just take a look at that. Just as Germany was split between East and West, you also have a split in Korea between North and South, which we've already talked about a little bit. A Soviet-dominated North, an American-dominated South. In the United States, policymakers believed in something called the domino theory. That just as dominoes lined up on the floor, you press one, you knock one over, it knocks another, it knocks another, it knocks another, until eventually they're all flattened. The idea was that if communism was victorious in one country, then that would allow communism to spread to more and more countries, eventually becoming this all-encompassing, irresistible force. You can see that illustrated by this picture on the left. You have a communist guerrilla in Vietnam, the Viet Cong. He's pushing over Vietnam, which is hitting Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, India, Bangladesh, right? The whole region collapsing due to this emergence of communism in Vietnam. And you see the American GI, he's trying to stop the fall of these dominoes at all costs. Now this is how American military planners saw the spread of communism in Asia. They saw it as part of their proxy war against the Soviet Union. They saw Asian communists as being associates of the Soviet Union in the same way that they saw the British, West Germans as being associates of the United States. But this is where American military planners generally work with bad intelligence, work with a different understanding than their adversaries, and this caused problems. From the perspective of many Asian communists, it wasn't so much about communism. Their cultures were traditionally collectivist. So, individual liberty and those kinds of ideas, these were not ideas that people were very concerned with, whether they were communist or anti-communist. For many of these so-called communists, it was more about being anti-colonial, looking at European colonizers with hostility, wanting to liberate these countries from the control of European colonizers, wanting to ensure that the nation was independent, that it was run without outside influence. It really is more of a nationalistic, and in some areas, like for example in Korea, there's an element of kind of a sort of hyper-racial consensus than one based on economics or Marxism or communism as a philosophy. So these ideas about means of production, mode of production, and capitalism, none of that really was on the minds of those communists who were fighting in Vietnam and in Korea. In fact, in Vietnam today, it's considered a great tourist destination for Americans because you can go and shop there and buy designer clothing, designer handbags, etc. for cheap. And of course, people are kind of, if you've read a couple of news reports where they stated, well, this is amazing, this turnaround. It isn't really a turnaround. The communist government in Vietnam was never truly about a controlled economy in the same way that the Soviet Union was. The communist government in Vietnam was very much an ethnic force, a force for Vietnamese nationalism. In particular, it gained steam by the idea of driving the French out of Vietnam. And you can see, again, this idea of communism in East Asia having kind of an ethnic component. You can see that in these images of American soldiers here in this Korean propaganda. You can see there's the typical kind of anti-Caucasian kind of racial images. This big crooked nose, the fangs, the tongue hanging out, blonde hair. If you look on the down here at the bottom right of this other poster, you can see an American soldier again with the same big hooked nose. There's a Japanese soldier to the left of him, portrayed in these kind of racialist ways, more reminiscent of how, ironically enough, of American anti-Japanese propaganda in World War II, that being taken by North Koreans and used as their own propaganda. But this propaganda is very ethnic in its orientation. And I thought that the one on the right was funny. It's extensively raised goats in all families. And of course, the propaganda was designed to stoke these kinds of ethnic feelings. You can see this U.S. soldier in this painting. He's dropping this baby down a well while the mother screams. And this is just civilians were killed in North Korea during the Korean War. The vast majority of them due to bombing, though. This kind of incident, this is just sensationalist, designed to, but really is part of the brainwashing of the average person in North Korea. And again, you have two Koreas. You have Kim Il-sung, the founder of North Korea, and you have Syngman Rhee, the first president of South Korea. Syngman Rhee is one of the reasons that the United States was involved in South Korea in the Korean War. He requested an enlarged American presence. He wanted the United States to he essentially escalated the conflict on multiple occasions. He agreed with MacArthur's idea of using the atomic bomb on China in order to win a complete victory over communism. That didn't happen. Truman, in fact, fired MacArthur over this issue and others. MacArthur being kind of a grandstander who was seen as being sort of disobedient, insubordinate to the president, so he was fired. But you have these two Koreas emerging, both of them drawing in these superpowers. You have Kim Il-sung requesting Soviet assistance, requesting Soviet support and money, and you have Syngman Rhee requesting the same kind of American military and financial assistance. Just as you see division in Korea and in Germany, we have division in Vietnam. We have a communist-backed North, Soviet-backed North, and a capitalist U.S.-backed South. And you can see, again, this idea of communism in East Asia having kind of an ethnic component. You can see that in these images of American soldiers here in this Korean propaganda. You can see there's the typical anti-Caucasian kind of racial images of this big crooked nose, the fangs, the tongue hanging out, blonde hair. If you look on the down here at the bottom right of this other poster, you can see an American soldier again with the same big hooked nose. There's a Japanese soldier to the left of him, portrayed in these kind of racialist ways, more reminiscent of how, ironically enough, of American anti-Japanese propaganda in World War II, that being taken by North Koreans and used as their own propaganda. But this propaganda is very ethnic in its orientation. Just as Vietnam was shaped by the division between a communist, a Soviet-backed side and an American capitalist, democratic-backed side, we also see these kinds of divisions in China. The Communist Party, revolutionaries under Mao Zedong, had taken over the country and established the People's Republic of China, or mainland China. And Chiang Kai-shek, the president of the Republic of China, retreated to the island of Taiwan, where he was able to hold his ground against the communist advance. This is in part due to the support of the U.S. Navy. The People's Republic of China could not cross the Straits of Taiwan and invade due to their naval, their weaker navy. And of course, this is as late as the 1990s. This conflict has flared up. If you recall, I think it's 1996. Then President Clinton had to send 2 aircraft carriers into the Straits of Taiwan to deter Chinese, very aggressive Chinese training maneuvers designed to intimidate Taiwan. One element of this Cold War, this competition between these superpowers, was in technology. And part of this concern for science, technology, for scientific advancement, part of this played out in the space race. The two superpowers struggling to discover more, achieve more in space. You have, for example, Sputnik, the first artificial man-made object to orbit the Earth. You have Apollo 11, the first, the man on the moon. These milestones in space travel were fueled by a desire for prestige, a desire to prove the technological power of one system over another, and also it was feared that through the space race, one side would gain a military advantage over the other. This was especially important in light of nuclear war. You have intercontinental ballistic missiles by the middle of the 1960s. These huge missiles that can destroy the world by 1980. Both sides could each destroy the world. The idea is that they had enough megatons to destroy civilization 14 times over. The idea that space could be used as a launching point for nuclear weapons, this was a huge concern. So the two sides are competing with one another on building nuclear warheads. Nuclear weapons, warhead is the actual nuclear component attached to a missile. You have ICBMs, or intercontinental ballistic missiles. You have SLBMs, or submarine-launched ballistic missiles. And then you have strategic bombers, like the B-2. The stealth bomber was originally invented as a weapon system that could deliver a nuclear warhead over the Soviet Union without being shot down, as a surefire way to use American air power against the Soviet Union. And both of these superpowers developing these weapons competed with one another in terms of the power and quantity of their weaponry. They didn't want to be outdone or to be seen as weak compared to the other. The Soviets and the Americans worked with a system called mutually assured destruction, or MAD. And that meant that no side would attack one another, because even if you had a temporary advantage, ultimately you would lose your own nation in the process. That if both sides could destroy one another, neither side would attack one another. And of course, the two sides looked for ways to get around this, and they also were fearful of losing their own ability to destroy one another as a deterrent. This is, for example, submarine-launched ballistic missiles. The nuclear-armed submarines were part of this. They're part of what's called a nuclear triad. You have intercontinental ballistic missiles in silos. You have missiles launched via aircraft, and then you have missiles launched by submarines. The idea is that if the Soviets struck first and in a surprise attack destroyed all of our missile silos in the United States, that they would then, and even if they shot down all of the aircraft that were launched, that were over the Soviet Union to release these missiles, then submarines out in the middle of the Pacific or Atlantic that were untrackable, they would be able to surface and fire their missiles. So there would be no immunity, so that no matter what happened, the Soviet Union or the United States both would be destroyed by a nuclear attack in a nuclear conflict. The two sides would come very close to all-out war in 1962. There had been a revolution in the island of Cuba, 90 miles from the coast of Florida. In Cuba, a communist guerrilla named Fidel Castro took power, and thousands of Cuban exiles fled to Florida. So you have a lot of people who have fled to Florida, fleeing communism in Cuba. Well, the CIA and the American government trained these Cuban exiles into a military force, and the plan was that they would counterattack, they would invade Cuba and unseat Castro. We call this the Bay of Pigs invasion. Now this invasion failed. Castro was able to defeat the Bay of Pigs invasion, but he was threatened by the prospect of the United States overthrowing him, of the United States using its actual military to invade and defeat him. So Castro strengthened his ties with the Soviet Union, and then the Soviets actually sent advisors to Cuba to train the Cuban military, but matters came to a head when an American spy plane discovered that there were actual nuclear missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, from the Soviet Union stationed in Cuba. And this was very shocking. You know, there are nuclear weapons 90 miles from the coast of Florida. This was seen as a violation of the United States sovereignty, a violation of the Monroe Doctrine, a violation, this idea of nuclear weaponry being in the Western Hemisphere. This is an enemy at the gate scenario. Same thing with what the Russians are experiencing right now with Ukraine. That their borders, their direct sovereignty, their homeland is being threatened by this encroaching foreign power. And so then the then President John F. Kennedy ordered a blockade of Cuba, a naval blockade, preventing military supplies from entering the country. And he threatened to invade Cuba if the missiles were not removed. And he stated that if any attack, any missile was launched from Cuba to any country in the Western Hemisphere, and Cuba has more enemies than the United States. There are other Latin American regimes hostile to communism and to communist Cuba as well, that it would be regarded as an attack on the United States by the Soviet Union. So thus the United States would attack the Soviet Union with the full might of its nuclear arsenal. So these two powers came very close to conflict in 1962. I'd like for you to go ahead and watch the video on the Kennedy speech over the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, so the Cuban Missile Crisis strained both sides. It strained relations between both sides. Eventually Khrushchev agreed to pull the missiles out. The United States pulled missiles out of Turkey in secret. The two sides worked out an amicable settlement whereby the conflict was avoided. However, this had strained not only the relationships between the two powers, but civilian control of the military in both societies. I'll give the example of the United States. There was an Air Force general named Curtis LeMay. He was the architect of the bombing of Germany, the architect of the bombing of Japan, firebombing of both countries. He believed that the United States had an advantage in 1962 and that they should go ahead and attack. He believed that conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union was inevitable, that communists and democracies could not coexist, that war would be inevitable, so that they should therefore go ahead and attack in 1962 while they have an advantage in missiles. They would have to fight eventually. It's better to attack now while we have the strength. That was his thinking. And so he insisted that President John F. Kennedy go ahead and launch these missiles. And, of course, that was not what Kennedy wanted to do. Kennedy wanted to try to find a peaceful solution while maintaining the liberty and sovereignty of the United States. So LeMay actually clashed with Kennedy, and LeMay had coined the term bomb them back to the Stone Age during the Second World War. And he had been part of the Berlin Airlift, and he was part of Strategic Air Command, the first commander of Strategic Air Command. So he was a very prestigious general, but he had violated this principle of civilian control of the military by being insubordinate to President Kennedy. And so, he advocated a preemptive nuclear attack. And as a result, President Kennedy had him removed from the White House. But it's important because Kennedy's control over the military was threatened. There were several military leaders were actually threatening Kennedy that if he didn't go ahead and launch this attack, that there would be repercussions. So right now, I'd like for you to go ahead and watch this speech, the famous Secret Society speech by Kennedy, that happened in light of these events. So Kennedy had come out of this experience where civilian control of the military had been threatened, where he was fearful of conspiracies, where he was fearful of an end to civilian control over the military, an end to a free and open society. Kennedy felt that the Cold War, that winning the Cold War might actually create a defeat for the United States, and that by winning the Cold War, the United States might employ the means of its enemy, that it might become a less free, less open society, one not based on constitutional rule, but based on this need for security. That the need for security would trump the desire for freedom, for liberty, and thus the United States would be defeated, even if it was ultimately victorious over the Soviet Union, by changing into something unrecognizable. And Kennedy wanted to make sure, in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and after experiencing what had happened behind closed doors during the Cuban Missile Crisis, that the United States maintained itself as a free and open society, as a democracy with the First Amendment, Second Amendment, etc. In the 1970s, there was a lull in the Cold War. We call this period détente, which is kind of it's a cooling of tension. In the 1970s, both sides began to suffer from economic problems. In the Soviet Union, the economic problems in the 1970s were crippling, though most Americans were not aware of that at the time. The United States had been reeling from the Vietnam War and from massive social unrest in the 1960s. And so the two sides were not eager to provoke one another. In fact, in the 1970s, the two sides had signed what was called SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaties, limiting the number of nuclear weapons, limiting the number of weapon systems deployed in general. So there was this idea that the tensions were easing. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and this was very shocking. The Soviet Union, this was supposed to be this period of détente. The Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan, and it was openly. It was seen as a violation of international law. It was seen as a sign of America's weakness that the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan without fear of the United States, any possible retaliation. And this and a number of issues eventually produced the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. And with the election of Ronald Reagan, the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan, the election of Ronald Reagan, 79 and 80 respectively, we have what we call Cold War II, the rise of Cold War II. And this is where the United States would attempt to escalate the conflict. Reagan and some other officials in the United States believing that the Soviet Union was on the brink of collapse, that the way to combat the Soviet Union was in fact to push it to collapse. With the arms race in the 1970s, there had been this attention on de-escalating the arms race. In the 1980s, the idea was to escalate the arms race because the Soviet Union was in fact economically struggling. There were shortages of essential commodities. The currency was there were problems with the currency. The socialist system was collapsing. I'd like for you to go ahead and watch the video titled "Protect and Survive." This is a video. This is a series of videos that was produced in Britain due to the fear of a renewed Cold War, of hostility between the United States and the Soviet Union, leading to nuclear conflict in the 1980s. And this was a series on how to survive a nuclear attack. There were pamphlets. There were also videos that would ostensibly be produced on television, informing people how to survive a nuclear attack. And of course, these were produced in secret. They would only be shown in the event of a nuclear war, but once it was leaked that the government had produced these, people began to demand that these videos be shown to the public. So go ahead and take a look at that. Okay, so this is the sentiment that many Europeans have during at least the first half of the Reagan administration, the one in which hostility is increasing. Reagan in the Soviet Union, Reagan was portrayed as this warmonger, as this aggressive, very militaristic leader. And of course, there was this fear that, especially amongst some of those who were in the know in Europe, that as the Soviet Union collapsed, a desperate Soviet Union would escalate conflict. And of course, conflict did almost occur in 1983 during an exercise called Able Archer. In 1983, the U.S., West German, and British militaries engaged in a training exercise which was based on halting a Soviet invasion of Western Europe. The idea was that the Soviet Union would invade Western Europe with these huge tank battalions. The United States would attempt to slow them as much as possible so that more troops could be collected from around the world to enter the front in Europe. And of course, part of this was defending against Soviet tactical nuclear weapons. So the United States aircraft were put on high alert. They were up in the air. Nuclear armed bombers were up in the air, circling, waiting for the go-ahead. And this was all part of a training exercise. But in the Soviet system, communications had broken down. Soviet command and control, even just basic radio equipment, had begun to corrode, had broken down due to these economic problems and this massive inefficiency, that the Soviets actually interpreted this training exercise, which 10 years earlier they would have been able to perceive as a training exercise. They actually interpreted it as an attack in East Germany. So the Soviet leaders in Moscow are getting these phone calls. Well, we're under attack. The United States, the Americans and British are attacking us here in East Germany. So the Soviets put their aircraft up in the air, put their missiles on alert, This is in part due to fear over what's called the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was a program just described by Ronald Reagan, not one that was successful. It was eventually replaced by the Patriot missile, developments of the Patriot missile later in the 1990s. This idea of the Strategic Defense Initiative, it's also called Star Wars. It was mocked as Star Wars by the media, but it was this idea that satellites would use lasers to shoot down Soviet missiles. So if this system actually existed, what that meant was that the Soviets would not be able to retaliate. So the Soviets were very fearful that and keep in mind that their system of communication has broken down, their intelligence services have broken down. There is a fear that the United States will be able to attack them without being attacked back, and so there's already this climate of fear about Reagan, about the Strategic Defense Initiative or Star Wars, and then when they see these American jets up in the air, there's a lot of panic. Eventually, it's realized that this is in fact a training exercise, and the Soviets begin to stand down. And of course, after it's all over, the Americans realized that the Soviets were freaking out about what was going on, and it came as a shock because this was in fact in no way a provocation. It was actual training, a realistic training for war, but still training nonetheless. But this is actually the closest that the United States and Soviet Union came to fighting over this mistake. But it's a sign that the Soviet Union was in fact crumbling. Just 7 years later, in 1990, the Soviet Union would collapse. Hardline communist generals would attempt to stage a coup to overthrow the then Soviet Premier Gorbachev, who was opening up the country with a program called Perestroika, and glasnost, or openness, in which the Soviets were allowed more freedom in terms of speech, in terms of media. They were allowed to participate in a growing, small but growing market economy instead of the kind of centralized economic control. But in 1990, this coup failed. The members of the military refused to shoot their own relatives. The generals called the military out to basically massacre their own people. The soldiers refused to do so, so they turned on their leadership, and the Soviet Union collapsed, ending the Cold War for good. Okay, in this second half of the lecture, we're going to discuss the Rwandan Genocide in 1994, and we're going to discuss it kind of in light of some things we've already been discussing, in particular decolonization. If you look on the right, you see this picture on the right. It says France equals killer. The genocidal, we protest the genocidal ideology of the French. And the French play a role in, the French government plays a role in, I don't want to say the French people, by and large, being opposed to this kind of interventionism, as is always the case, generally speaking. But the genocide is in many ways an effect of a side effect of French policy, the French desire to maintain empire, to maintain an international presence, and particularly one in Africa. In 1994, between 500,000 and 1 million people were murdered, primarily with machetes. This is the second worst direct genocide, not involving starvation, in terms of numbers since World War II. In China and the Soviet Union, since World War II, in China, we've looked at the numbers dwarf but those are people who were starved to death by the central government. This is a direct genocide not involving starvation. The United Nations could not prevent the massacre, this was a massacre carried out primarily by people with machetes. We're going to look at the conditions that produced this massacre, and before we do that, I'd like for you to just watch the brief video summarizing the genocide. Okay, we're going to summarize the ethnic conflict. There is tension between two major groups, Hutus and Tutsis. You have two cultural groups that are very similar to one another in many respects, but who evolved different cultural roles, and these differences were exacerbated by the era of imperial control. In the 15th century, the Kingdom of Rwanda, the pre-imperial state Kingdom of Rwanda, and you can look at these really this is an amazing picture. You can see the very unique headdresses of the king with his various knights in this royal court. In the traditional Kingdom of Rwanda, the Tutsis were an aristocracy. They were the ruling dynasty. Most of the members of the nobility were of the Tutsi group. It's comparable to, say, Norman England in the Middle Ages. The Normans, people from Normandy and France, they conquered England under William the Conqueror. They ruled over the Anglo-Saxons. The aristocracy was Norman. The common people were Anglo-Saxon. It's a similar kind of deal with I'm trying to think of an example really quickly. You know, in the Japanese Empire over Korea, you have a Japanese ruling elite ruling over a great mass of Korean people. And it's a similar kind of situation with Tutsis. The Hutus, who were farmers, they had been reduced to serf-like status. They were not cattle herders. They were not great warriors. They were horticulturalists, agriculturalists, and the Tutsis conquered the land. The Tutsis migrated in, they conquered the land, they established the Kingdom of Rwanda, and the Hutus, to work the land, had to exchange manual labor in favor of the Tutsis, the individuals you see pictured on the left. As this kingdom expanded militarily, the Tutsis expanded. The Tutsis are similar to the Maasai in that they're militarily skilled. They were primarily cattle herders, and so as they expanded, they absorbed new groups into the population. Those groups were also called Hutus. So you often hear the statements are made that that these differences didn't exist in the past, that these are products of Belgian colonialism, and that's not true. These differences existed. Tutsis were a ruling class who ruled over a large Hutu population. Hutu, while it doesn't technically mean any one ethnic or linguistic group, it means those who it does include all of those who were in serf-like status, right? Those who farmed the land for their lords, who were the Tutsis. This is a difference that existed in antiquity, and it's not something that existed in that came into existence in the era of colonialism. It was exacerbated by colonialism. The colonizers used these divisions to administer their colony, but at the same time, these ethnic distinctions existed traditionally as well. In fact, their origins are in a military conquest over, and it's similar in many ways to the Incans. You know, the Incans conquered different Andean peoples. The Incans ruled as an aristocracy, as an elite, and the conquered peoples were reduced to kind of a serf-like status, working the land for the Incas. The Incan ethnic group is a similar situation. In 1923, the Belgian kingdom, and Belgium again, had gained a League of Nations mandate to govern Rwanda. And they wanted to govern it in the name of the traditional monarchy. So you have the traditional king. The Belgians had made this case that the king needed outside help to govern his kingdom, which is, you know, an absurd idea. And the Belgians issued ethnic identity cards to people, to Rwandans, which exacerbated these pre-existing ethnic tensions. So the tensions were already there, but the Belgians accelerated the division. The Belgians favored the Hutus. They favored the great mass of people, the agriculturalists. They favored them instead of the Tutsis. The idea being that they would be able to use Hutu anger at the Tutsis and resentment of the Tutsis being their overlords in the traditional kingdom of Rwanda, kind of like the aristocracy in Russia, for example, the great Tsar and his family. They're these elites, and anger is directed at them. The Belgians directed anger at them in order to maintain control. The Belgians ended up splitting the kingdom into two, into Rwanda and a country called Burundi. And this was an attempt to dissuade ethnic violence with Hutus and Tutsis. The idea that there would be two states. Of course, people did not cleanly migrate to around to produce two homogeneous states. Right? It's in the manner of India and Pakistan. India and Pakistan are the template for this. India and Pakistan end up splitting. You have millions of Muslims migrating out of India into Pakistan. You have Hindus in Pakistan migrating into India. The idea being that this would dissuade ethnic violence, but it didn't work so evenly in this period. You can see here this picture of Juvenal Habyarimana, who was the Hutu president of Rwanda, and this is important for the conditions of the genocide. An ideology called Hutu power had begun to develop in radical circles, particularly among journalists. Journalists and academics. There was a lot of inequality in terms of wealth. The Tutsis, despite the fact that they were a minority, controlled a disproportionate share of the wealth. It's similar to, say, the Chinese population in Malaysia. In Malaysia, the Chinese population is small, but it is very wealthy. Thus, Chinese Malays of Chinese ethnic background are forbidden from serving as officers in the military, and there is a system of quotas designed to put ethnic Malays into positions of power. And there's a lot of resentment towards the ethnic Chinese population. It's the same thing with the Tutsis and the Hutus. This ideology of Hutu power rose up due to anger over this inequality. So again, like with Germany in the 1920s, like with we talked about Japan after the Great Depression, with an ailing economy, radical political movements can gain greater and greater authority. And so those who advocated Hutu power, and this idea of the Hutu 10 Commandments, particularly a guy named Hassan Ngeze, they began to use the radio to demonize the Tutsis as cockroaches, to condemn them, to call for their extermination. We look at the Hutu 10 Commandments. We see something very similar to the Nuremberg laws enacted in Germany in the 1930s. These are principles that are enacted, generally speaking, in most ethnic supremacy states. Every Hutu must know that the Tutsi woman, wherever she may be, is working for the Tutsi ethnic cause. In consequence, any Hutu is a traitor who acquires a Tutsi wife, acquires a Tutsi concubine, acquires a Tutsi secretary or protege. So the idea is that Hutus should not mix with Tutsi women. Every Hutu must know that our Hutu daughters are more worthy and more conscientious as women, as wives and as mothers. Aren't they lovely, excellent secretaries and more honest? Hutu women, be vigilant and make sure that your husbands, brothers, and sons see reason. All Hutus must know that all Tutsis are dishonest in business. Their only goal is ethnic superiority. We have learned this by experience from experience. In consequence, any Hutu is a traitor who forms a business alliance with a Tutsi, invests his own funds or public funds in a Tutsi enterprise, borrows money from or loans money to a Tutsi, I spelled that there, grants favor to Tutsis, import licenses, bank loans, etc. And you notice that these first 4 commandments are concerned with traitors. They're concerned with those Hutus who are on the side, are seen as less loyal to the cause of Hutu power. And this is how, racial supremacy movements always seem to take off in the modern era. You first begin to attack those who collaborate with the enemy. The enemy, from your standpoint, you begin to call them specific names. For example, in the Reconstruction era South, there was the name Scalawag. That was a native Southerner who sided with the North in the American Civil War, who supported Reconstruction, the emancipation of the slaves, etc. And you see this in every kind of racial supremacist group, a condemnation of all those who, whose loyalty is seen as less than sufficient from the racialist perspective. And then on the right hand side with the last 5, you see that these are commandments centered around ethnic supremacy. Strategic positions such as politics, administration, economics, the military, and security must be restricted to the Hutu. A Hutu majority must prevail throughout the educational system. The Rwandan army must be exclusively Hutu. The War of October 1990 has taught us that. No soldier may marry a Tutsi woman. Hutu must stop taking pity on the Tutsi. Hutu, wherever they be, must stand united in solidarity and concerned with the fate of their Hutu brothers. Hutu, within and without Rwanda, must constantly search for friends and allies to the Hutu cause, beginning with their Bantu brothers. Hutu must constantly counter Tutsi propaganda. Hutu must stand firm and vigilant against their common enemy, the Tutsi. The social revolution of 1959, the referendum of 1961, and the Hutu ideology must be taught to Hutu of every age. Every Hutu must spread the word wherever he goes. Any Hutu who persecutes its brother Hutu for spreading and teaching this ideology is a traitor. Rwanda is a former Belgian colony. As a former Belgian colony in Rwanda, the traditional official language, and keep in mind in many of these countries in Africa there are many different customary languages, so English or French will often be used as an official language because it's a neutral language that all of the different ethnic groups can learn to speak with one another. It's similar to India. People will speak English to one another even though they might not know various languages, regional languages. And in Rwanda, the leaders of Rwanda, the Tutsis, wanted to take Rwanda in a more Anglophone direction. Start teaching English, start encouraging young people to learn English as part of development, as part of moving towards industrialization and economic development. And of course, this was a big blow. Rwanda was part of Francophone Africa, and as such, it was considered threatening that to some who wanted to maintain a French international prestige and standing, even though it was a Belgian colony, the Belgians speaking French, the dominant imperialists of the 19th century speaking French, and of course the French speaking French. The idea was that Rwanda should be kept within French orbit. And again, these groups were at one point funded by outside powers. You have the Hutu militia funded by French. You have the Rwandan Patriotic Front funded by the United Kingdom. And these groups are kind of, again, this is a kind of proxy war between former imperial powers. In 1994, the plane of the Hutu president was shot down. There are a number of conspiracy theories about this. Many of them and many people have placed the blame on the French, that the French actually, the French Special Forces or French Secret Service actually shot down this plane to fuel up Hutu nationalism, to fuel up Hutu anger. The French were partisans of the Hutus. If the French, again, remember that idea of a false flag operation. The idea is that the French would shoot the plane down, and then they would blame the Tutsis for it, and so this would rile the Hutus up, and it would bring the Hutus and the French closer together, because it was, the French did not claim any responsibility. In fact, the blame was placed on the Hutus inside, the Tutsis inside Rwanda. So radio DJs and journalists began to list the names of specific individuals who should be killed. Eventually, this snowballed into entire communities being massacred. And again, going back to France, the current president of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, has been very, very hostile to France, accusing the French of being involved in shooting down this plane, accusing the French of having a direct role in the genocide, as well as the Belgians. And this has caused quite a bit of controversy. So, but all of that is largely irrelevant. I mean, just know that this is an outgrowth of decolonization, the end of imperialism, the instability in many countries as imperialism kind of retreats, and again is one example of how outside intervention and interventionism, for good or ill, can have these massive after effects and unintended consequences. But there were 6 components that went into this genocide, and this is the same pattern we see with again in the 1930s in Germany and other instances, even of not really genocides, but ethnic cleansing through peaceful means, like for example the issues with Fiji, with Malaysia, and also outright genocide such as the one in Bosnia. There's similar patterns there. We've got a dogma of racial supremacy, where one group is hailed as superior to another. The other group is dehumanized. Their feelings, their emotions, their culture is portrayed as non-human. There is an ailing economy, And this, of course, is the other group is blamed for having a disproportionate share of economic piece of the pie, whether that's Jews in 1930s in Germany, whether that's Tutsis in Rwanda in 1994. The idea is that, well, we're enduring all of this hardship while Group X over here is raking in the profits. Right? And that is a principle that generally follows these patterns. And like in Germany, you have a culture of obedience. In Rwanda, both for Tutsis and Hutus, Rwanda is, even though it seems counterintuitive given we're talking about this genocide, it's actually a very lawful society. This is a society where laws are very strict, where people are very obedient to authority, where the hierarchy, those on top of the hierarchy can have a great amount of power, can command a great amount of respect and obedience from those beneath them. And it's similar to Germany, it's similar to Japan in that respect. There's prior planning. We have the journalists, the different members of the Hutu intelligentsia drawing up drafts of how this would occur. And finally, you have a highly politicized incident, the shooting down of the president's plane. This is an instance in which rape was used as a weapon. This is what rape has been used as a weapon throughout human history. And keep in mind that the Tutsi women, and you just read in the Hutu 10 Commandments, that the Tutsi women had been vilified as being seen as agents of racial pollution. And it's similar to the way that Korean women were perceived in Japan in the 1930s, thus the development of the comfort women, if you remember that lecture. But this is new in that HIV was used as part of the equation. It wasn't just rape, it was rape plus an infection with a deadly disease. So of course the HIV infection rate doubled in Rwanda during the genocide due to these rapes. There's a French-Canadian general named Romeo Dallaire. He was the head of UN forces in Rwanda. He had learned by using spies. He was a very crafty military leader. He learned that a plane carrying French arms and military advisors had landed in Rwanda, and that these were being illegally distributed to this very radical Hutu-dominated government. And of course this was happening. The French were unloading these weapons. He had learned of this, and he wants to do something about it. He is supposed to be the head of the international community there, and his superiors told him that was outside the United Nations mandate, that he shouldn't interfere, that there was nothing that he could do. So he had to sit idly by while these extremists were being armed, while this foreign country, their military advisors were entering the country, really just messing up the entire situation. He couldn't do anything about it. He feared that the situation was escalating out of control. He kept warning the UN Security Council. They were telling him that there was nothing that he could do about it, nothing that they could do about it. And of course they were laughing off his claims that there was going to be a serious problem. I mean, he was saying, there's going to be ethnic cleansing on a grand scale here if we don't do something about this. And of course people denied that, how could, they accused him of crying wolf. So he fortified what territory he could with Canadian and other international soldiers, some of them from Pakistan, and he shielded 32,000 people from the genocide, but that's a small number relative to the 500,000 to 1 million who were killed. Of course, he blamed himself for this, attempted suicide in 2000. At this point, if you wouldn't mind going ahead and watching the trailer to the movie Shake Hands with the Devil about Dallaire. Okay, this is also a period where U.S. intervention, the American public was generally wary of intervening. And of course now it seems like that position is universally condemned, that the U.S. stood idly by, no one's stopping to think that it was outside powers that helped exacerbate these ethnic tensions to begin with, and helped actually produce indirectly produce the genocide, and there's always, it seems to be in the media, especially when we start talking about globalization, people use that term so irresponsibly now. But the idea that the U.S., if the U.S. had gone in, and this is my bias here, if the U.S. had gone in, a bunch of American Marines had shot and killed thousands of Hutu, which was what would have been necessary to prevent the genocide. You saw videos and pictures of American soldiers interrogating guerrillas, and basically the kind of actions that would be necessary in that kind of situation. That also would have angered the same people who are angry about the lack of intervention, which is just that's neither here nor there. What is true, though, is that not long after this, out of the controversy over the United States not taking a role in preventing this genocide, we actually see the United States attempt to prevent famine and a humanitarian crisis in Somalia. And of course, the incident of Black Hawk Down, the film Black Hawk Down, the book and film, with U.S. Army Rangers' corpses being dragged through the streets, the United States being condemned for the fact that these soldiers managed to cut a swath through the attacking Somali mobs that descended upon them. The United States, in fact, did do what these interventionists had pressured the then President Clinton into doing, and it ended in disaster, with all of the food aid going to Somalia being gobbled up by warlords, with all of with Americans being killed, and with the United States in a worse position in terms of prestige than previously. Again, this genocide is in part being due to the fact that a foreign power, Belgium, exacerbated an already tense situation. The Rwandan Patriotic Front, Tutsi exiles, managed to invade and seize control of the country. After this point, 2 million Hutu refugees, especially those who had participated in the genocide, fled Rwanda for neighboring Burundi. After this, the conflict began to spread outside of Rwanda, as different countries, those who supported the Hutu funding the Hutu, those who supported the Tutsis funding the Tutsis, and this would be one of the contributing factors to the development of the Second Congo War, the most destructive force since the Second World War. Of course, the Second Congo War is in part an extension of this ethnic conflict between Tutsis and Hutus, but it's also a result of conflict over minerals as well.